Hello and welcome to the Political Orphanage, a home for plucky misfits and problem solvers. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton.
I have been to China twice, and I don't plan to go back a third time. The first time was at the tail end of my college days when I was doing a study abroad in China. At the time, China was still in the process of opening, or at least it very much felt that way. China was enjoying a prolonged economic boom from the market reforms of Deng Xiaoping. I recall the president of my college, David Boren, talking about how China had started out communist, but was drifting towards liberal democracy, whereas America had began as a laissez-faire society, but was increasingly appreciating the need for regulation. And we were meeting in the middle, you see? And there was this feeling at the time that China was opening up, liberalizing, joining the world. When I visited, there was a new book out that was considered very controversial, Mao Zedong, Only Human. What made this book so salacious and controversial was twofold. First, that a writer would feel comfortable describing Mao as a human being instead of a god. People still thought of Mao as something more than human. I saw his preserved body at the Forbidden City in Beijing and watched as people would genuflect and cry in front of his remains the way you might honor a saint, the relics of a saint. But the other thing which made the book controversial was that the government had allowed such a tract to be published. I didn't read the book, it's in Mandarin, but I gather that the author had acknowledged that Mao, while a great man with very good intentions for the greater good of China, he had made some miscalculations. Now, I would say those miscalculations were about 50 million people that starved to death, but there were probably some other things in there. Either way, acknowledging that Mao had screwed up was not something which would have been thinkable in public a decade earlier. But now, when I visited, during this period of opening, Mao was only human. The second time I visited China was little less than 10 years ago. I was leaving New York City, and I had been invited to participate in the China International Stand-Up Comedy Festival in Shanghai. And immediately upon revisiting the country that second time, I could detect a shift. First, the first tip-off was I had a very difficult time finding my Airbnb because Gmail had been outlawed, as had Facebook. They were too insidious. They were foreign influence. And also, what if people used these uncensored mediums to spread messages that were deemed inappropriate by the government? Much better to use WeChat, a combined go-to social media app which also allows for financial transactions. Very convenient. All of which is under strict government oversight so that the people that are running the country can keep tabs on any illicit purchases or anti-social media comments. But the really big thing that I noticed that really stuck with me was comedy. When I went to the comedy club, the owner, who was an Australian, told me the ground rules. We're looking forward to having you tell jokes here at the China International Stand-Up Comedy Festival. None of those jokes will include Taiwan, Tibet, Tiananmen Square, or any living member of the Politburo, but particularly Xi Jinping. In no uncertain terms, I was informed that if I made any jokes about any of these topics, I would seriously jeopardize the entire comedy club, which might get its license revoked or worse. So, if I happen to drift into any of the verboten joke material, the lights would immediately go up, the evening would be over, the audience would be kicked out, and so would I. So don't do that. To which I said, Tibet, Tiananmen Square, and Taiwan, that's my whole set. What am I going to joke about? But that was a joke. I'm very funny, you see. I was joking. I didn't have any material about those things. It didn't actually affect my set, but it did piss me off. It did piss me off that they were putting restrictions on what I, a political satirist, was allowing to satirize. Later, I hung out with some other comedians and musicians at lunch, and they'd been there for a while. They were expats, and they told me that if I decided that I wanted to stay in China, I would need to submit my joke book to the authorities, who would remove any jokes they considered antisocial or subversive. To which I said, I'll be damned if I let some gray-blooded, soulless bureaucrat do punch-up for me. And I took off. I doubt I will return to China a third time. Probably if I did, I would be fine. Almost certainly I would be fine. I am a small fry. I am not on the radar, but I don't know. I once wrote a book called Laughter is Better Than Communism. And while I was over there, I had some very choice words about the Politburo when I was making Skype calls back home. It's possible, and in fact probable, that those phone calls were being recorded. Again, unlikely that they would ever do anything with it, but it's possible. So between the low risk but high impact possibility of a clash with the authorities and the humidity, I just don't have much desire to head back to China. Today on the show, I'm going to talk to two other creative people who can't go back to China, who have in fact been exiled from China. A journalist who was expelled from that country by virtue of conducting journalism instead of agitprop, and a political cartoonist who dared to do the unthinkable and made jokes about the authorities, perhaps even Tibet, Tiananmen Square, and Taiwan. Authorities hate jokes. Oh, and we get into whether or not China is communist or fascist. I think fascist. We'll get into that. All of that today, right here on The Political Orphanage.
My guests today are Melissa Chan. She is an Emmy-nominated journalist specializing in transnational issues, particularly China's influence beyond its borders and the rise of global authoritarianism. She's based between Los Angeles and Berlin, but she's reported from diverse locations, including Cuba, Canada, Mongolia, Moscow, and now both North and South Korea. Her work's been featured in prominent publications such as the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Time, The Guardian, Foreign Policy, and Politico. But for our purposes today, she is the author of You Must Take Part in Revolution, a graphic novel. And she is joined by Badiucao, who is an artist and political cartoonist, as well as a political activist. He resides in Melbourne, Australia, and he's done solo expeditions in Italy, the Czech Republic, and Poland, and has been profiled in both 60 Minutes and the New York Times. And as of 2020, he won the Human Rights Foundation's Václav Havel Prize for Creative Dissent. And he is the illustrator of You Must Take Part in Revolution, a graphic novel, which you can find on Amazon, but also you can go to mightyheaton.com/featured, and you'll see that in all of the books that we discuss. Hello, Badi and Melissa.
Hi. And I should also add that Badiucao is also a co-author, where we sort of try not to differentiate between the two.
Thank you.
We give each other enough feedback on both the writing and the art that we've tried to blend that sort of authorship.
I appreciate the correction. Okay, you're both co-authors on it. Thank you. Well, I'll kick it off with this. You've got a piece of fiction that really focuses on the authoritarian dissent that's occurred in Hong Kong in particular, but can happen writ large. But you've also lived through it, both of you. I believe you've both been exiled from China. Is that correct?
Yes, in different ways.
Well, so then let's kick it off with that. Melissa, what did you do to get exiled? What happened?
So I was reporting in China for, at that point, 5 or 6 years, had filed 400 reports, had traveled all over the country, had increasingly started reporting more on human rights issues, not by choice, not with a sense of mission, but if you spend enough time on the road reporting in China, you start seeing bad things happen to good people. And I was just doing what a reporter does, which is try to make the powerful accountable. And I don't think the Chinese state really liked that. So long story short, in 2012, I became the first foreign correspondent to be kicked out of China in more than a decade. I think the last time that had happened was 14 years ago to a Japanese foreign correspondent. And at the time, I was actually the Al Jazeera English correspondent in Beijing. So not exactly Western media. And actually a representative of the Global South as a network. So that was an interesting situation. I could go further into it, but that's essentially what happened to me more than a decade ago at this point.
Was it a specific situation where the straw that broke the camel's back, or was it just an accumulation of your reporting? Did you know the moment where you'd gone too far?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. I think it'd be inaccurate to say that it was solely because of my reporting. I think the political winds were also changing in China at the time, and the state wanted to send a general message to the foreign reporting community in China. Back then, there was, I think, more than 400 foreign correspondents spread across the country, mostly in Beijing and Shanghai. And they weren't quite ready politically to kick out a foreign correspondent from a U.S. organization, the U.S. being the superpower. So they felt like they could sort of kick out an American citizen that was working for a third country media organization. So there was that calculus played into it. And it was a few years after the Beijing 2008 Summer Olympics. And there was a perceptible political turn in that time of the state wanting to be a little tougher. And this was before the leadership of Xi Jinping. It was right at the cusp, but it was at the tail end of the previous leader, Hu Jintao. So a lot of people tend to say that, China is bad these days because of Xi Jinping. And I've always argued that it was always headed in this direction, regardless of which new leader took over. And that a lot of the sort of change and shift in terms of political freedoms was already happening under the previous leader. So there was the political situation and the fact that they didn't like my reporting, and a really interesting element, which is maybe perhaps too much information and too much detail. But the fact that I'm ethnically Chinese really pissed the government off. They feel that, and this will be, I think, possibly interesting to talk about in later on in this conversation. But China feels a sense of ownership over everyone who is ethnic Chinese, regardless of our citizenship. So they don't view me as fully American. Ironically, the one place in the world where I've been told many times I'm not American is not some racist in the United States. It's actually been in China. And so they view this the same with Chinese Americans, Chinese Australians, with Badiucao, Chinese Canadians. We have all betrayed the motherland when we become reporters and report critically on China, the same way actually we do in the United States. And I always made a point of pointing that out to them, that I'm just as tough on the U.S. government when I'm reporting stateside, but they didn't see that.
I did not know that sense of ownership persisted. So like I'm of primarily English and Scottish descent, and I live in Scotland part-time. Nobody thinks I'm Scottish. Like I'm from Oklahoma. My family left 3 or 4 generations ago. Like it's just there's no sense to them that I am a Scot living in North America. But that is typically how the Chinese government works. Like they think about that in terms of like ethnically Chinese people in Singapore as well. Taiwan, I would assume, because I gather there's a lot going on with Taiwan, but even Singapore and other countries?
Yeah, I mean, it's an extension of an unhealthy sense of nationalism. It's an extension of the propaganda. Gosh, I'm really going into the weeds now, but yes, they think about that with the Singaporeans as well. And really interesting little fact is that the Singaporeans, in order to remind the Chinese of their sovereignty, because 70% of Singapore can speak Mandarin Chinese, but when there are diplomatic meetings between Singapore and the People's Republic of China, like between foreign ministers or between diplomats, the Singaporeans make it a point of speaking in English and having their translator translate into Mandarin and then back that way. It's a way of reminding the Chinese that, yeah, we might be able to speak the language, but we're not going to meet you where you are. And we're going to remind you that we're a separate sovereign country. And we're going to do it this way by using English, which is another language that they use there in order to remind the Chinese that, we're not like you.
Badi, what did you do to get exiled from China?
So I'm actually born in quite an artistic family in China. My great parents were the first group of filmmakers, were very active in 1930s until 1950 when the Chinese Communist Party is in power. And my grandparents' brother got persecuted because of their artworks. So you see, this kind of artistic but also troublemaker bloodline has running through the generations. So when I grow up, I feel like I want to fulfill the potential of my family heritage or gift, but I also realize if I want to do something about art, I might just get myself into trouble, like my great parents' generation. So when I started making art that targeting China's human rights or political issues, I try to be anonymous as much as possible. So Badiucao goes as artist name. From the very beginning, I wouldn't actually do any podcast or, which was showing my face or showing my real voice for about 7 years to practice as a secret artist that targeting the Chinese government. But in 2018, just 3 days before my first solo exhibition in Hong Kong, well, the worst things happened and my identity got compromised. And resulting in my family back in China got taken into the police station for interrogation for the thing that they don't even understand. And in the end of the day, they become the messenger for the police and sending me this warning that they want Badiucao disappear. They want me to stop making arts. Otherwise, quote unquote, there will be no mercy to me nor to my family. So that's the real beginning of the whole direct harassment that against me, but also putting my own and as well as my family's safety on the line. And but for a regime like this, you can't really bargain in wisdom. You can't say, okay, I'm gonna sacrifice my freedom now just so I can have my safety back. And in fact, if you do so, you might just lose both. So I make decision that I do not want to be owned by such authoritarian regime. I want to continue making arts the way that I like. And that's why I started showing my face, attending all the events and having exhibitions. But of course, the price after that is there'll be more direct harassment from online space, death threats, almost in a daily base. There will be agents been sending to Australia or in Europe while I'm having exhibitions. I've having been experienced being followed, harassment, cyberbullying. And I guess the worst thing that happening is actually the Chinese government has this very long arm to casting censorship within the art community, whether it's in political cartooning or exhibitions in museums or galleries. For all my exhibitions that have been done in Europe, in Italy, in Czech, and in Poland, the Chinese embassy or sending threatening message, email to the museum as well to those governments, foreign department and culture department, government of Italy, Czech, and Poland, and demanding the show to be cancelled and framing me as some kind of anti-China or xenophobia artist, saying me hurting the Chinese feeling, regardless of my Chinese heritage. So this is what they do. And really, for me, I'd be very problematic if I go back to China. I believe I'll instantly be arrested or disappeared if it's worse. And also, the risk is not just within traveling to anywhere close to China, but even transferring via flights. I've been warning by the Australian government that do not take flight that middle transferring in any Asia country or Middle East country where they have treaty or extraditional bill with China because the risk of adopting or arresting is so high.
Badi, I want to apologize in advance just because we've got kind of an unstable internet connection. I may not be able to hear everything you're saying. It should be fine for listeners. But if it sounds like I'm ignoring what you're saying or I forgot what you said, I am paying attention. It's just that it's a little bit choppy. So I apologize if anything gets mangled in the international communication we're doing.
No problem.
So you were doing a show in Hong Kong, but you're from mainland China. The family's in mainland China. And that's kind of what kicked things off, if I heard you correctly.
Well, that's the first time they actually find out my identity, right? Before that, I successfully hide myself. Thus, they do not have the full picture. And what they do is launch a lot of online campaign against me by via like character assassination, by making stories, collecting my personal informations. And when they have enough things, they find out mapping out who I am. Thus, the direct harassment began, which is resulting my family being in trouble in China by the Chinese National Security Police.
What kind of stuff were you doing then? So, like, having gone through your wonderful book, I get why the commies don't like you now, because you wrote a book lampooning authoritarianism and living in a dystopian authoritarian world. Totally makes sense to me. If I were a commissar in charge of political satire, I'd lock you both up. But prior to that, what were you doing that was pissing them off in your artistic endeavors?
I would say there's only a handful of Chinese artists who are there to challenge the authority, whether it's inside of China or outside of China. So I have been doing political cartooning to targeting Chinese leaders, the current leader Xi Jinping, since 2011. And thus it makes them see me as a state of the enemy. I mean, a lot of people probably familiar with the meme that comparing between Winnie the Pooh and Putin, compare with Winnie the Pooh and Xi Jinping. And I would say I was one of the earliest artists who started to promoting this meme to the internet via my creation and political cartooning. So, those kind of things is the thing that the Chinese government feel they cannot control, and they fear the power when people starting to see the great man as the great man, but just a mortal guy who can be mocked. And these things has been a bread line for the Chinese government since the very beginning.
Yeah, authoritarian regimes really don't like laughter. There's something about it's more dangerous to have people laugh at you because then you're not frightening, I think. And so there's something deeply destabilizing to people in power about that it would actually be better for you to write like an angry pamphlet or to break a window than to try to make people laugh at the leader, because that's actually insidious in terms of the power structure.
Exactly. I mean, here's the thing. While all the dictators like Xi Jinping or Putin or Trump, we'll say in America, who is a dictator wannabe, they all want to create this strongman image, which means they are beyond mortals, which means you can't touch them. You can't really make fun of them. They're the only one who can crack the joke. They're the one tell you when to smile and how you laugh. And once you take that power away from them, then you basically losing the whole control of the regime.
Melissa, in your role as a journalist, did you have people nudge you in particular directions? Would like people that you were interviewing, would they kind of take you aside and be like, look, I can't tell you what happened? Or alternately, would you have people that were part of the Politburo structure contact you and go, hey, we understand what you're doing, but can you 10% easier on us? To what extent were they issuing you diktats or guidance in terms of censorship?
They would put pressure on you, but as a independent foreign correspondent, it's not the same relationship as if they were in control of the state media reporters. What would happen is you'd face intimidation. The people that we interviewed would potentially also be pulled aside and intimidated later or threatened. And so one thing I learned very early on in all my interviews was to explain to people that you're taking a risk. And I'm not going to be able to help you necessarily if you get in trouble because you think that I'm an American or, we work for some international news organization, we can come save you. That's just like the reality is that we might not be able to do that. Would you still want to do this interview at that cost? And to a surprising extent, people wanted to talk to us, often because they're so aggrieved, like something terrible happened to them. Their child died because of negligence or, I can go on and on to the many stories. And so people want to be heard.
You kick off in your book SARS, like one of the main characters in the book has been sort of animated because her granddaughter died from SARS, which was then covered up. And that's her source of grievance with the regime.
Well, the real thing that happened to me was I covered the Sichuan earthquake, which killed almost 70,000 people, many of them children, because the government in Sichuan province spent very little money building sturdy schools, but all the government buildings didn't crumble, or most of them didn't. And everyone very quickly noticed that the schools were the ones who crumbled and the children were the ones who died. And that became a big point of grievance among the population then. And so even though in the book, we have a fictional character who died from SARS, which was the precursor to COVID, really. I mean, anyone who covered China and Hong Kong 15 years ago would not be surprised at the development of COVID and the spread of COVID, because it was the same thing, a cover up and so on and so forth. And one would think that, and to a certain extent, some of the Chinese epidemiologists did learn from that experience and were trying to actually spread the news about it, only to be jailed or detained. And some died for it, right? Died from COVID, but under detention or control. And so, there's in many ways, like, our book is fiction, but you see, like, it's not exact correlations to my experiences as a reporter, but it's sort of embedded in different themes and manifested in different ways. But so we would face threats from the government. You wouldn't get somebody from the Politburo, but it would be like the foreign ministry or the person in charge at the press office or the police in charge of the foreign correspondents in Beijing, and they would talk to you, but they really couldn't control what we reported. And it was at a time where we transmitted all our broadcasts, like our edited broadcast reports, via the internet. So it was a different age. By that time. In terms of, look, I've been followed, I've been surveilled. I'm pretty sure my apartment was bugged. There was a time when I was in the Xinjiang region, which is the region where the Uyghur minority is, and they've been targeted as a group and held in detention camps over the last few years. There's been lots of evidence of that by both the admission of the United Nations and media organizations such as New York Times, AP, Reuters have all done reports on that. But we were in the region, this is before the detention period. And I remember traveling around Xinjiang for 9 days, and for 9 days straight, we were followed by 2 cars, each car with 4 men, and they would take rounds, like take turns. It was kind of obvious because it's sort of like almost Keystone Cops sometimes. So there was all kinds of intimidation to try to curtail things. On the other hand, there was another natural disaster I covered where someone from state media came up to me. We were just on site at the same disaster zone. It was completely chaotic. No one's really paying attention to us, including, it's just too much chaos, right? And an emergency. And the person told me the actual death toll figures that they had, which was different than what was being reported by the state. And this was a state media reporter. And they were like, well, your foreign media, please report the truth. I can't. So there's little ways of people trying to subvert the state and get the truth out. And those moments are very poignant and stick with me.
So for the people that you warn, if you do this interview with me, there's a potential cost. I can't get you out. I can't help you. For you, fortunately, you're able to leave the country. You have citizenship outside of China. You've been exiled. It was scary, but you're okay. What happens to them? Like if I'm in the province that was hit by this earthquake, and I'm like, yeah, the people here are corrupt and incompetent, and a bunch of children died. The regime's awful. Do I go to jail? Like what happens to me?
So to my knowledge, the worst thing that has ever happened to anyone that I've interviewed is that they were detained for like 1 day, maybe possibly 2 days, but they were eventually let go. So it was a different environment in China than today. I don't think that would be the case today. Things are a lot tougher now. And you kind of develop as a journalist, you develop a sense of where the line is, even when the line is constantly changing. And so at that time, we were able to do that and get away with it. And the reason why people want to talk to you is that something really terrible happened to them. And the judicial system in China will never give them the justice that they deserve. And they know that. And so it's my sort of armchair psychology of this is, why would you do something that'll put yourself in more trouble? Is that they want it for the record. It's completely psychological, even if it's like for Al Jazeera, and it gets aired overseas and no one else they know sees it. It just means that it existed. This terrible thing happened and that other people saw it. It's very psychological, but that's kind of my analysis of why people do what they do.
Can you both unpack for me what the relationship is between dissent and the Chinese people as a whole? And what I mean by that is, in the United States, or when I'm in Britain, or when I was briefly in Australia, I can be very aware of everybody that's disaffected as a group. It's very easy to tap into that. In China, is it just I'm an individual that's angry, but I don't know that other people are angry because they've clamped down on it? How atomized is it? And then beyond that, to what extent do people differentiate the regime from the nation? Here in the United States, I'm quite capable of saying I love America, but I don't like the president. To me, they are very different. I think of the country as different than the government. I don't think the government in China feels that way. I don't know how people on the ground feel. So unpack this for me, if you would. And Badi, why don't I kick it to you since we've had Melissa talk for the last couple of minutes?
Actually, it's a very deliberate strategy for the Chinese government to mixing and blurry the boundary between, let's say, nation, state, government, and the people. And that's a very clever strategy to silence the criticism against Chinese government, whether it's inside of China or outside of China. When you cannot tell the difference, then suddenly if you making a cartoon mocking Xi Jinping, creating a graphic novel calling out China's human rights record, like what we did, instantly will be referred as anti-China or xenophobia. And in that way, it silenced a lot of people who are particularly from the liberal camp or the progressive camp, because the least thing that we want is being labeled as racism, but that's how China plays the book. And it goes inside China as well. Because of that, they grow and manipulating the younger population into nationalist instantly. When you can't tell the difference, and every criticism become a attack on the nation or become the attack on the people itself. And then the second point, yes, I mean, the China's Communist Party is the only and the largest organization that can be active in China. And aside of that, everything rather, useless decoration. If you want to have a group, let's say even union in the communist regime should be, just normal and much more efficient than the capitalism.
Like a workers' union.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
but in fact,
yeah.
in China, if you dare to organize a real union fighting for the labor's rights, then you'll be in real trouble. And the same logic goes to any, social groups like LGBTQ. I mean, for China, it doesn't really have this religious background, the anti-gays and lesbians, but still, Chinese government will cracking down with iron fist. And the biggest reason behind it is they fear that people organize themselves, whether it's gender or other political norms, that they seem like they are part of a group other than CCP. And then that's when the Chinese government tried to cracking down. And that logic has been, practiced in every aspect in the Chinese society. So among the dissident in China, whether it's inside of China and outside of China, you always feel that the difficulty to connecting to each other. And it's almost a mission impossible in China. But outside of China, there's also a lot of infiltration. There's like dodgy dissident who are probably active spies to infiltrate the groups. One of the reasons incident that I have in Australia is rather shocking. So someone is impersonating me. So the Chinese government finds someone with my similar look and the build and approach to another very high profile Chinese Australian, Chen, who was a CGTN staff who got arrested in China. And after a long time of diplomatic struggle, she finally got released back to Australia and suddenly become this star of Chinese Australia who can tell, the dark side story of China. Then someone just pretending to be me and approached to her in order to, I don't know, getting her information, break into her circle. So that's how the Chinese government is using all the methods to cutting people from their connection and creating doubts and interest so that people cannot work as a group against the regime together.
And I would just add that what he just talked about, this impersonator, was actually journalists worked on this story for The Age, and it was a magazine feature. Like investigative journalists in Australia worked with Badiucao to try to track this person down. So just in terms of fact checking, and sourcing.
Melissa, what do you make of that? Like, do you find a similar level of disconnection? And do you find that people on the ground in China are apt to relate the CCP to the nation itself?
Yeah, I would defer to Badiucao on his answer because he's much closer connected to what's happening in China right now. I left China so long ago that it's it's just too long for me to say. But my sense was that people were brought up to equate the state with the nation and with the leader, and that they, you know, often could not differentiate between the two. So I would interview somebody, and there was this one time where I was interviewing someone who was deeply mistreated by the state. I can't even remember what it was, but probably his land was stolen. He was a farmer, like really down and out, right? And he stopped halfway through the interview and suddenly paused and was like, "Is this going to make my country look bad?" And I was like, thinking in my head, bro, like the state just screwed you so bad, and you're still looking out for it. So that kind of propaganda that they teach since childhood is really embedded in Chinese. I mean, of course, every country has its own form of national identity that they build into public school education, but
Right.
in China, they do definitely equate the state with the leader, with the party. And I often say that I, care about Chinese people, but I don't care for the government. And I would say this to people to try to remind themselves that there is a difference.
Is there any concept of patriotic dissent? We're recording this July 10th, and we just celebrated July 4th, and I had conversations with friends here in the United States about, we've heard these things before. I love my country. That is why I'm criticizing my country. It is not because I don't love America. It is, in fact, because I am deeply motivated by love of America that I critique it, and so on and so forth. Is there some variant of that within life in China, or is it just the government's doing a bang-up job, everybody trusts the man?
I don't know if Badi wants to talk, but yeah, there is Chinese dissidents do love their country, and they say that's why they are critical of it. It's reminds me, I mean, just to take it away from China, but Alexei Navalny was a deep patriot. He loved Russia, right? To the point that there are a lot of people who just didn't like him and felt he was quite complicated, because at one point he was such a big tent opposition, he included and was open to far right extremists also being in the opposition. So I do think there's a strand of dissidents all over the world who deeply love their country, and that's why they do what they do. But I think, it, like all things, the dissident community has a variety of people with very different convictions.
Oh, I guess what I meant more of is that allowed openly? Like, can you be on television in China and go, I really think the Politburo miffed it this time, or do you have to be like everybody's doing great?
Even if you have the willing, you won't have the mean to do so, because every platform is already censored and monitored. That there'll be no way you express that on TV, and there's a price to pay. Even if you just complain on your social media, and even for private gathering, if you got reported by one of your friends that you believe is friends to the police, then you get yourself in trouble. So this kind of chill effect has been running down for decades because of waves of political purge of the campaign, from Cultural Revolution to other waves like cracking down on the Tiananmen Mosque student movement in 1989. So it really scared people to the bone to even to think about that.
I just want to say something before I forget, because you had asked Badiucao about earlier, or it came up about like there being very few artists that are critical of the Chinese state. One interesting thing is that there are a lot of Chinese who live overseas who are critical of the Chinese state, but they tend to be critical of one period, which is the Cultural Revolution. And I have this theory: it's because it's in history, it's in the past, it's not contemporary China, so it's the safe kind of criticism that you can do. And we do see artists, contemporary artists, sort of engaged in that conversation. And what happens is, in the West, people say, oh, well, look at this sort of provocative Chinese artists, with their Cultural Revolution sort of commentary. And that's actually the safe thing in many ways, but like criticize the current leadership, and that's a very different thing altogether. What I would say is that China is an effective authoritarian state. It's if you follow its AI legislation that there are, and sort of like regulations that they're trying to roll out. or when we look at how they deal with climate change or renewable energies, this is an authoritarian state that believes in science, as opposed to most authoritarian states that don't believe in science. And so when you do have that, you do need people with different opinions, but it's always framed, and it's within a very safe space, such as academia, a few think tanks. And when they do criticize, it's done very obliquely and gently. But there is a little bit of a feedback mechanism, or else it wouldn't be as effective as it is today, which is the second largest economy in the world. So I do want to sort of frame things a little bit to explain why it is as effective an authoritarian state as it is. They do take a little bit of sort of feedback, but again, on science issues, on AI, but nothing directly against the leadership or the inviolability of the Communist Party of China.
So there might be like verticals where, like, I am an engineer and I'm working in Harbin. I am allowed to criticize the local council on its engineering, but I'm not going to weigh in on tax allocation, or I think they're doing a crummy job with the parks. Like, I'm going to stay in my lane in a very differential way.
Yeah, and it'll be in a research paper, and it'll be very
I can't just stroll in. I will.
No. Buddy, you were going to say something. Go ahead.
The red line is the emperor is always right. It was those people who beneath him who maybe practice it wrongly. Thus,
the Tsar's a great guy. The Tsar is a great guy. The problem's all these boyars that are misleading our beloveds. If the Tsar just knew what we were going through at the hands of his thieving subordinates, of course, being a kind-hearted man, he would come to our defense.
Yeah. I mean, I would go a little bit further to that. Melissa mentioning about there was a period of time it seems okay for the Chinese contemporary artists to criticize Cultural Revolution and Mao, but it's very much also played and manipulated into the political atmosphere in China during a very specific period of time. Because when Deng Xiaoping was in power, he was seen as a reformer who changed the trajectory of the country different from Mao. And only in that period of time, they have a brief window to allowing artists to do this kind of Andy Warhol mocking or pop art style of kind of making some interesting portraits of Mao. But now, as she's in power, he's re-established the flag of Mao like never before. So we have seen current example, the Chinese artist who got arrested in China for a work he created decades ago, which is a statue that making Mao look funny. So even this dissent is carefully organized for the interest or for the power dynamic with the party. But if you dare to change or challenge the trend of the political atmosphere, you're getting yourself in trouble anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's also like why I think the book is really provocative for Badiucao to co-author. You Must Take Part in Revolution, because it is not just about contemporary China, but it's also the near future China. And that's just the kind of time and space that you're working in that is the most sensitive.
Okay, so what is the regime so frightened of? Like to hire an impersonator to try to destabilize your life body, that's a level of obsession that's really high for a political cartoonist. I make funny videos for a reason. No one knows or cares about me outside of about 1,000 people. No one's hiring like impersonators to make me look bad. So what is the fear that the Chinese regime has? What do they think might happen if they loosen their grip?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, in democracy, you can suffer from a certain level of dissent, but still have a peaceful transition of power. But in China, there's no such a thing as peaceful transition of power. Everything has to be under control, 100%. Thus, they feel like they cannot risk any of the losing control bit, especially for a wild spirit like artists. The other thing is about it's this absolute power of the strongman or dictator's image that they have been preserved in China. China is a communist regime, which means it really downplay the religious side and replacing the religious figure. It will be this great man. It will be Xi Jinping, Mao Zedong, or other Chinese leader. Thus, they are no longer just human beings. They're literally man-made gods. And if you dare to mocking the gods, then they feel like they're losing this very control in people's ideology or spirits. That's something that they cannot afford. But here's another thing. I mean, imagine you're building a dam for authoritarian, right? The pressure keep piling up, and you cannot tolerate even the smallest crack. And artists usually are the ones who create those tiny cracks. It seems like why is such a big deal when you just compare the yellow bear to Xi Jinping? It wouldn't really destroy the nation. But for them, from their perspective, that is the crack that can spread like a virus and eventually destroy the dam once for all. So they always want it to be under control. They cannot let it go.
The other thing is that we know very little about Xi Jinping, but one of the few things we do know is his obsession and fear with the end of the USSR, to the point that there's at least one of the very few things we know is that he has people watch this documentary that is essentially about the fall of USSR and Glasnost and Perestroika and how all of that was really, really terrible. And so his view of maintaining power for him and also for his party is not to let that dam have any crevices in it, because what happened is look at Russia and what happened in the 90s, in the post-Soviet period, and how completely messy it was and unstable and weak. So that is like an obsession of his.
That I follow the logic there. I mean, like my read on the fall of the Soviet Union is that Gorbachev, who I guess is my favorite Soviet premier, saw the writing on the wall, and he went, well, the economic system's not working and the political system's not working. What we'll do is we'll have a little bit of capitalistic reform economically, and we'll have a little bit of democracy that we spackle into the Soviet structure, and then people will love us so much for having given them more democracy that it'll make us popular and we'll win all the elections that we allowed them to have. And what happened was people went, oh, this is great. I'm going to vote for the nationalists in my country. I don't even like the communists to begin with. And the whole thing just kind of fell apart. So I could totally get an authoritarian regime looking at that and going, you don't want to spackle your authoritarianism with freedom. That just makes the whole situation worse. Crack down.
Another thing I want to point out for this craziness on control, and sometimes it's also because those middle level or low level officers want to create a scene so that they can have the funding from the national security budget. China's national security budget supports its defense budget every year. And thus, by making those bizarre cases mean they will have more funding and resources and perhaps winning the trust or the favor from their superior. Thus, they have a better career path. So, it's sometimes maybe Xi Jinping don't really want that. But because of he has established the system, and that's a one-way system, you can only do this. You can only jump as high as he wants, or imagine he wants you how high he wants you to jump. And that's the situation there as well.
Badi, I love that explanation. That is some fantastic public choice analysis of authoritarian regimes, that it's not just mustache twirling, we hate freedom, but rather an incentive structure combined with self-interest. And if I am the assistant party secretary in Shanghai, and I can crack some skulls and I thereby display my value to the party, I might get more funding for my particular department coming out of the state budget. That's a really interesting idea of how they allocate resources. That makes a lot of sense to me.
The deep state exists everywhere.
Well, how about this? For those of us that are in liberal democracies, the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, what do we just not understand about China? What is something that we are apt to miss in terms of what's going on over there? And Badi, I'll kick it to you because you're in Australia and you're from China.
I think probably one of the biggest problems for Australian government currently is this constant balance or miscalculation between economic interest in China and national security threat. And this ideal obsession of China's economic miracle has been played as a toxic element into the understanding of China for such a long time, to a point that my country now, Australia, miscalculated the down forward of China's economy. And because they've earned the money, they've had the cake and chocolate for so long, and they want to keep the status quo forever, and refusing to seeing that it is simply not sustainable to keep investing or try to making money from China with its current political and economic tendency. Well, on one hand, the Chinese economy, I believe it is in huge trouble now with its aging population and dying birth rates. I believe China's economy is very much building on this very cheap labor, which is crediting its huge population, particularly younger population. But the one-child policy that has been running down for decades in China has destroyed the structure of the population. And that's why even the Chinese government realized that, oh, okay, we cannot have this model anymore. We have to pick up the high tech and replacing those cheap labors by, selling EVs and other elements. But would it really change the model successfully? Would a dictatorship have the capacity to turning around as efficient as democracy? I'll put a big question mark. And also the zero COVID policy running down by the Chinese government during the virus time also really, set back the economy to a level the younger generation do not feel they have a future to have a better job anymore, like my generation. And that is also why towards the end of the COVID time, the China has this massive nationwide protests. And all of those things is a sign saying the China's economy is no longer sustainable and development as long as running in the same way. I would say if there's no political reform, the Chinese economic miracle simply cannot continue. But this things is largely ignored by countries like Australia and a lot of European countries as well, because they still want making money and investing in China and riding along China's 7% of GDP growth every year. But that growth is just not there anymore. But on the other hand, because of this downfall of the economy, the Chinese government is trying to make a change. And one thing is high-tech development, but the other thing is seeing expanding its territory, learning lessons or copying what has been done by putting Russia via invading Ukraine. I mean, a lot of analysts are saying that one of the reasons Russia's doing that is also because of economic reason, because the COVID is killing its own economy. And the same situation has been played out in China. That is why the hype of invasion in Taiwan is such a topic recently. And also, we try to use our graphic novel to dive into this possible future for China's invasion in Taiwan. But if that unthinkable event is going to happen around time of 2030 or 2027, as Xi Jinping said, he needs the country to be ready for the war by the time, then countries in Pacific region like Australia should really pay attention to what China is doing, to pay attention to its building of a military island in the South China Sea and circulating warship around Australia, and spewing lasers and flares against the Australian air jets. All of these things is largely neglected and overlooked because people still want to believe we still want to make money in China, and we don't want to care or think too much about those risks that lying in the future.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is that Badiucao, like as he's talking, reminded me of the fact that our book is very interesting. It's not an Asian American book. It's actually a book by two members of Chinese diaspora from two different countries. So Asian Australian, Asian American. And so you get this very interesting perspective from Australia where, Australia is a Pacific power, as is China, and as is the United States. But I think it's much more front and center in terms of the relationship between Australia and China. Now, I've had the opportunity to think about my answer to your question, Heaton, and a couple of things. I want to respond to Badiucao's comments about the Chinese economy. In many ways, he says it's unsustainable, and that is something that both the Biden administration and the Trump administration, at least the people who have done their homework properly, are on the same page with, which is partially why there's been so much bipartisan sort of agreement on dealing with China. To a certain extent, that is also, I guess, what's driving Trump's tariffs on China is because China's economic model is unsustainable in terms of its impact on Europe, on the United States, on the rest of the world, including in Latin America and Africa, because it's producing so many goods, it's exporting to all these places and causing economic sort of imbalances in each of those countries, right? I'm not an economist. I won't go further into it, but all this to say that I want to address the political climate of the United States and its foreign policy right now. And there are sort of kernels of directionally, in some ways, the Trump administration, at least some people understand the issue. I'm not entirely sure their way of going about it is the right way. But it is true that the Chinese economy is deeply imbalanced. But I would say, of course, the U.S. one is as well. And then to the original question, I would say that the one thing people need to know about China is that in the U.S., the rhetoric about the Chinese Communist Party, especially, I would say that the members of the GOP, some of the more extreme members, their rhetoric is very 1960s and Dr. Strangelove. And, if you want to view China as, if you see China as a serious competitor, you need to know the country as it is and not what you imagine it to be. And far too many American politicians imagine China in this sort of really basic, silly Hollywood 1960s way. That is just not the case, right? And the same thing with the term communism, the way it's used in the United States. As a domestic issue, oh, so-and-so is communist. And it's just like, if you've been in China, you know China's history, or Russia, you know what communism is. And, some of the social democrats out there, they're not communist. And the conflation of those terms, I think, are really, really muddying the waters and doesn't help. And frankly, Americans should be better educated at just what the Chinese Communist Party is today and what communism, lowercase c, is, and all of that.
No, I agree with all of that. And like you're talking to somebody who regularly gets really hung up on terminology and gets really irritated with people when they do it, to the point where, and please push back on me on this one, I don't think I would actually call China communist at this point, because I would say really they're fascist. Like they have a authoritarian state-directed capitalist model. That's fascism. Like the way fascism operates is the private sector owns the means of production, but the government tells you how to use it. So you get to have a shoe factory, but the government's going to come to your shoe factory and go, you're not making sandals anymore. You're going to make boots, but you get to keep the money from it. And like that to me sounds more like what China's doing right now than the Soviet model, where there's a ministry of shoes and a ministry of forks and knives and things like that. So I'm with you. I think that the terms get misconflated all over the place, although please push back on me if I've got that wrong.
No, I actually wrote one of the early articles a few years ago about whether the press in the United States should start calling China a fascist country as opposed to an authoritarian one. And not just what you just pointed out, but also the revanchism, the push to have ethno-national, the push to have more Han Chinese children. Now they are encouraging 3 after a one-child policy of many years, encouraging the birth of more Han children while suppressing the births of minorities. Traditional family values is very big for Xi Jinping. So all of the things that are hallmarks of fascism are also in China. It's just that we're so wary of using the F word. But I think deserves a serious look.
We need to come up with a new term like this.
Because it's really, so loaded to the 1930s, right?
It's so loaded. Like
we need a new ism then.
Yeah, there needs to be
there
because
needs to be something.
Technically, like economically, the term would be corporatism. But if I say corporatism, people think I mean a thing run by corporations, which is not the definition of it. And like I have to be careful because sometimes somebody will describe economically what is fascism. But if I say fascism, they think I mean racist. I'm like, that's not really what I. Yeah. Yes to all those points. Follow-up question for you, Melissa. As somebody that really dislikes authoritarianism, I think I am still kind of rooted in a Cold War mindset from the 1980s. So our conversation so far, China sounds very authoritarian to me. It does sound like it's a little bit Dr. Strangelove. How can I update my mental model to be more appropriate towards the reality of China today?
I would just say it goes back to that whole, it's one of the interesting authoritarian states in that it believes in science. In fact, actually, as Badiucao said earlier, Trump is a wannabe autocrat, and you see people in his administration that are doing things that are counter to science, particularly in the vaccine space. The Chinese have no problems believing in vaccines and the fact that they work. They have no problems believing in climate change and pushing economic policies that will benefit their country and their people and grow their economy at the expense of other countries, even in terms of dominating the solar power industry and the renewables and energy industry in both hardware and the raw inputs of that, including rare earth minerals and so on and so forth. So this is a very interesting state because often with authoritarianism and with strongman leadership, you start getting a lot of frankly, fake news and
Right.
anti-science sort of approaches. What makes China a particularly interesting and effective case is because it believes in science and technology. And what's really interesting is if you follow what it's trying to do with legislation on AI, you can even argue, there's even an argument, if it wasn't an authoritarian state and we're just looking at sort of the policy proposals being pushed, that it is being much more proactive and responsible in terms of trying to wrap its mind around, like the thinkers and the specialists on AI, trying to deal with this technology. To a certain extent, it's kind of a weird duality, right? We talked about surveillance, and there's a lot more surveillance in China than in the United States. But, the party members, of which there are more than 80 million, they don't want to be surveilled by AI. It's kind of weird. So then they are actually kind of proactive with creating legislation to sort of set up guardrails and at least rules of the road for their companies. I don't know. It's a little more complicated than that because TikTok, we all know, like TikTok is a piece of a social media platform that the Chinese won't even allow the Chinese to use themselves, right? They have their own version of TikTok that's not called TikTok in China. So, we'll feed the crap to the rest of the world that's dangerous. But in China, there are far more guardrails to their version of TikTok and so on and so forth.
To flip an earlier question, what do people in China not get about liberal democracies like America and Australia?
It's incredible how much they don't get, particularly when you think of how many Chinese students come and study in the United States. I'm going to Badiucao, do you have any thoughts to jump in? And then I'll think a little bit more because I don't even know where to begin. The list is so long.
Well, I would say because the nationalism propaganda is running so well in China for a long time, that a lot of young generations are believing that the China model is superior and better than democracies. But that misunderstanding is shattered a little bit during the COVID time, when the zero COVID policy really making mega cities like Shanghai or other very rich development town almost remind their memory of what happened in Cultural Revolution. So they have this delusion. China is different. We're so rich. We have high-rise building everywhere in town like Shanghai. But during the COVID time, that when the unfisted social control really kicking in, they realize, okay, we're still the same animal being tamed and controlled by the cage of CCP. Thus, it triggered into this white paper movement that you never seen this since the 1989 student movement. The young generation took the street, take the risk, and demanding this very policy to be ended. And actually, during that time, I was in a very hopeful mood that I feel like there might be something is going to be changing China because of the economy downwards, because the young people are seeking difference and waking up from this very brutal social control during COVID time. But then we have Trump at second presidency, then basically seeing the biggest betray within the Western camp or within the Democratic camp itself. And when Trump saying, you think we're not doing the same thing to those people? We don't care about human rights. We're going to do it anyway as long as we make money. That challenged the waking up generation to eventually seeing that, okay, maybe democracy is hypocritical. It is just same as practical as our own government. So now I've been experiencing this upward and downwards on understanding of the Chinese population. But I have to say, there's still ripple and influence from the COVID period that we talk about Chinese students who study overseas, right? But I do think with the current generation who experienced that they cannot, leaving home for 3 months, they do not have enough food at home, and eventually get a chance to go overseas to study again after that period, would have a slightly different understanding from the previous generation. But again, their new thinking is challenged by the change in America greatly, I would say.
I think that it does dovetail with what Badiucao says. Even very sophisticated Chinese, including diplomats who spent a lot of time overseas. I just remember, and this goes back to the start of our conversation where I said that the most times I've been told I'm not American has been in China. As opposed to one would imagine, some white racist in the US. No, never happened, right? And it's because of their inability to understand the concept of citizenship and a republic and a democracy, and that there's a naturalization process, and that there really is a belief that we strive for in the United States, even if we fail often, but we strive for, which is equality for all. It's another conversation, all the problems going on in the United States, but I'm fully an American citizen in the same way that you are an American citizen. And there's very rarely, never I can think of in my life that someone has questioned my citizenship from a fellow American, right? That concept, they can't quite get their mind around. So I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding. Despite all the soft power and the movies and TV series, there's a cynicism among quite a number of Chinese that it can't quite possibly be this good. So I've had lectures implied and direct by Chinese officials when I was in China, where they were trying to sort of in the beginning talk me into look at you. What are you doing reporting so negatively on China, right? You're part of the motherland. And the thing they'll suggest is they'll never treat you the same as we treat you. You're Chinese. We treat you as equal. And in their mind, they cannot wrap their heads around the possibility that a white American would see me as fully American. But actually, that is the case. And it's just this mental thing. I don't know if I'm explaining myself very clearly because it's so subtle.
Follow it. It is weird. I mean, this is one of the things I love about America is
it's magical, right?
Yeah.
I mean, my dad was born a barefoot sort of farmer boy, 22 generations of people to our knowledge that didn't go to college, right? And here we immigrated to the US and I went to Yale, for God's sake. And that is what America has given me. And that's why I believe it is a country worth fighting for, including right now because of the dangers going on in our republic. And so this goes back to the idea of democracy. They just feel like, hey, who's that?
That's my dog, Wallace. So what
Wallace.
I used to do, I used to have Wallace sit on the couch, and I had a Wallace cam independently film him, but that was kind of a hassle. And then here the last few days, Wallace has just decided that he's okay to come in around 6 o'clock and lecture me that we haven't gone on a stroll yet. So I think that's what's going on.
Oh, well, that's cute, maybe.
Apologies.
No worries. I'll wrap up our thought. I mean, my thought, which is that, democracy is messy. And as Badiucao says, that's what the Chinese state sells people on, is like, ooh, look how messy democracy is. But you know what the alternative is to democracy when people want real change in China? It's a bloody revolution. So, as messy as democracy is, election after election, let's just keep that in mind. And I think that's one thing that a lot of people, even in China, don't quite understand. They'll sort of mock. I even have people mock democracy, right? Like, look at your elections, look at January 6th, and it's just like, well, okay, that's all really bad. Yes, I agree. But, the alternative is something extremely bloody.
I'd rather be in a dive bar than prison. Like, yes, there are some downsides to it, but I'll stick with it.
Sorry, if I may add, this actually a interesting tension within China. Like, on one hand, they have this ultra-nationalism, the alter ego, believing that the Chinese system is better. But on the other hand, they also believe, because somehow the Chinese culture running for thousands of years, and we have a different culture, that we're simply not capable to running system of full democracy. Otherwise, there'll be total chaos. So this very contradicting idea is booming in China all the time, right? We're very confident, but we also look down our people's quality that we don't deserve democracy, and we can only organize society with or around a strong man. And that's the problem that actually Chinese government, they haven't been able to really solve. And on the other hand, I would say this very idea of democracy is something the Chinese government cannot totally ignore. Like, the Chinese government invented this very word called whole process democracy. And in the
I love it. Whenever there's democracy with hyphens, love it.
Yeah, like
we always want those hyphenated democracies. They're always great.
Like, they denounced democracy, but they didn't throw away the whole concept of democracy. But what they do is they re-fulfill the meaning of it, to dilute the meaning of a democracy, to fulfill it with socialist characteristic in the China way, like what they did in 1984. They created a new word to replace the old word, to replace the meaning. But on the other hand, they can't just throw it away completely. That in China, there's also a propaganda or ideology campaign called 12 Socialist Values, which is a 12 character, including democracy as well. So you see, the Chinese government here is actually not trying to say we're not democratic, but rather to create a more competitive storytelling to challenge whether it's democracy in America or West or American dream, that China have the China dream. Thus, it's showing, I think it's kind of showing its weakness as well, because it cannot persuade people 100% that democracy is bad. So that they have to invent a new democracy in China in order to saying, okay, we actually have better democracy instead of not having democracy.
I want to be respectful of your time. We've gone a little bit further than I thought we were. Can I keep you for 5-10 more minutes? Because I've got a couple of questions I want to lob at. It's okay. I'm going to cut this out regardless.
I mean, I'm worried about Wallace, and his walk. So.
Wallace is fine. Thank you for asking. We've been having a day. When I lived in Austin, Texas, he kind of implicitly understood that when I was talking to the weird rectangle that I am mesmerized by for hours at a time, that he should leave me alone. That has faded away now that we've moved to Washington, D.C. So he'll just come in and announce that we're going to play. Okay, how about this? I got a weird question, but this is going to help triangulate things for me and for listeners. Both of you, please play along with this. If we were going to do a 1 to 10 scale of authoritarianism, I think I'd put North Korea at 10. I think that's the most authoritarian country there is right now. So let's put that as a 10. Where's China?
And I've been there.
And you can adjust your scale as needed, right? So
Yes.
where's China on this 10-point scale of authoritarianism? Where's America? Where's Australia?
Where's one? What would you say is
I'm
one,
not
though?
sure. I'll let you pick one. I'll let you. What is the least authoritarian country in the entire world? That's one.
I don't know, Finland or Iceland or something.
Sure, we'll do that. We'll go with Iceland. Iceland's one. North Korea's 10. Where do America, China, and Australia fall on that scale?
I think China's honestly 8 or something.
Badi, do you think that's about right?
Yeah, well, I think China is a dynamic and a moving turn. It has the potential to go full North Korea if Xi Jinping keeps running this trajectory. And the only reason it is not doing that is because it hasn't beat America. It hasn't mapping out the full control of the world. But there's a potential it could embody the full model of North Korea in the coming future.
You know, the thing is, the reason why it's 8 or possibly even 9, which sounds very extreme, but it's not, because it's, again, an authoritarian state that believes in science, which means an authoritarian state that believes in technology, and is the authoritarian state even more so than Russia, than any other authoritarian state, with the money to have this technology to surveil people very fully and very completely. I put it at 8, and Saudi Arabia maybe 9, because they're buying the products from China to surveil, and they're also theocratic, and
they've got a lot of creepy stuff you allude to in the book with like social credit scores and stuff. That stuff's deeply creepy. That if I retweeted one of Badi's political cartoons, or I just put an emoticon on it or whatever, and now I can't use public transit anymore, or I am now restricted to I can only buy groceries within 3 miles of my house. That way I can't spread they're deeply authoritarian and like very clever and scary stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's in its early stages right now. I mean, there's been a lot of misreporting about the social credit system as it actually exists. But in our book, we obviously took it to a different level. Where do I put the United States? I don't know. I'm going to keep thinking, but maybe, Buddy, it's how well you can answer while I continue thinking about where the U.S. goes. That's a tricky one.
For Australia, I think it may be 3 or 4.
Okay.
It's on the right track, but it's also
So it's closer to Iceland than China.
Yeah. Australia is also under this massive influence and manipulation of China at this moment. So a lot of things are not going very well in this country, particularly on the freedom to criticize Chinese government. Well, I've mentioned I do exhibition in Europe, but I didn't say I do any exhibition in Australia, because I'm also heavily censored in Australia. Regardless, it's a democracy here because of the economic dependence on China. So a lot of galleries and institutions will actively perform self-censorship in order to not, getting China anger on any issues.
One thing that's really bothering me right now is the amount of money that has been funded towards ICE that, in essence, creates an independent police or law enforcement that is loyal to the president more so than to the Constitution, and is going to be larger than the FBI, the CIA, and all other law enforcement agencies short of the military. And that has the characteristics of a lot of authoritarian and fascist states, the beginnings of it, right? Independent Stasi or Gestapo. And I'm very worried about that. And we're not there yet. And what we're seeing now, and of course, it's not something, social media, of course, captures all these incidents, and it's not happening on my block yet. It's not pervasive, but we are seeing masked law enforcement grabbing people off the street in a way that is questionably legal for the lack of due process, and that is kidnappings. And I will say that you actually don't see this in China. Armed people, masked, grabbing citizens off the street. That's not how they deal with repression. It's a different way. So those things I think are really, really troubling in the United States. And so I would put it I'm hesitant to put it at 6 because that's close to 8, but I would put it 5. I wouldn't put the U.S. at 4. I would put it at 5, with a big disclaimer that it could change a lot, even in the next 2 or 3 months, depending on when this podcast comes out.
Yeah, that's scary. But I think there's a lot of things that can go sideways or metastasize. I mean, for much of United States history, one of the big contentious points was, should we even have a standing army? There was a significant amount of fear that, look, standing armies are needed to have a tyrannical regime. Well, we don't need one of those. We just have a militia of farmers that shows up to fight when we need them, and then everybody goes home. And like, do we really? And there's, I think, a lot to that. Melissa, you've brought up a couple of times over the course of our conversation that China is an effective authoritarian state, that they believe in science, they have epistemological mechanisms in place that allow them to interface with reality in a productive way. I agree with you on that.
Mostly believe in science, by the way. I mean, I'm just saying that for all the, there's, for every statement you make, there's people who will be like, well, Xi Jinping's really into Chinese herbal medicine, but okay, mostly believe in science, yes.
Right.
Go ahead, sorry.
I think we could say it's more effective and more productive than most other authoritarian regimes that have got to that level, I think. You are now a dystopian writer. Both of you are dystopian writers. You're in the same club as George Orwell. When I was a kid and I was reading about 1984 in high school, I read this article that basically went, and this is right after the Soviet Union collapsed, but before 9/11. So it's when everybody's like, we did it, we won, everything's going to be great from here on out. The takeaway from 1984 was, look, authoritarian regimes collapse under their own big dumb weight. You can't sustain a regime based on hatred and power and evil indefinitely. Eventually it collapses. And so the implication was that authoritarian regimes carry within them the seeds of their own destruction, and they will inevitably come to collapse. There's a lot of technology and a lot of thinking that the Chinese regime has really put into place to make sure that doesn't happen. Do you think it'll go on indefinitely? Do you think there's anything to that, or can they just go on forever?
I mean, one thing that I say is that 21st century authoritarianism has learned from the lessons of 20th century authoritarianism, things that they will not let happen in the same way that did happen in the 20th century that led to the fall of authoritarian regimes is allowing for too much protest. You give a little inch and then, the protesters will take a mile, and then the house of cards falls apart. And so I think that's one lesson. The other thing is, of course, the Stasi at its height had 1 in 5 citizens spying on each other, right? So it took a tremendous amount of human energy and commitment. But now we have technology, so you don't need as many human participants in order to do that level of surveillance. So I think surveillance is a very big part of 21st century authoritarianism, even more so than in the 20th. And they have ways to do it in a way that makes you feel less surveilled. So, you're using your phone to use Google Maps or a mapping device to get you from point A to point B. How efficient, and how wonderful if a state like China would know exactly where you're going from one place to the next, right? So I do think that we're up as people who care about freedom and liberties. We're up against much more complex dynamics because of the marriage of the technology to the desires of the state, wherever they are, including in the United States. And so I think that the possibility of authoritarian regimes lasting longer, maybe. I mean, certainly with China, the way I look at it is this is yet another dynasty. And some of those dynasties lasted hundreds of years. So that might be that, in our lifetimes, we will not see the end of the Chinese Communist Party, or, something like a house of cards, as Badiucao has said. And I just really want to underscore, because I'm not entirely sure if it really got communicated, is that that whole COVID lockdown broke people's brains in China in a very interesting way that I even found interesting in our U.S. Book tour, as we met some Chinese students who had come to the United States fairly recently in the post-COVID period. And you could sense that had a massive, massive impact on them mentally, in the same way that COVID had its impact on American Gen Z in a different way, right? And that whole generation all around the world have reacted and responded to their COVID experiences in very interesting ways. So in China, there was a big moment of this is not working, this authoritarianism, this government, this control, we need out, which is why you still have so many Chinese students who want to come to the United States despite, not quite rolling out the welcome mat these days. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. I guess, our book is not meant, it's near future dystopia. It's not meant to prognosticate for real. It's actually, a lot of it is to focus on the costs of resistance, and how we each might want to resist. And, I don't know if yes, this has not come up, but it is about a techno-authoritarian China at war with a fascist United States, where people are being detained once again. Is that really that crazy of a thought? I guess so, but then they're detaining people extraterritorially in the United States and sending them to places. So the next step is, and of course that budget for ICE also means that they're going to build new facilities. So yeah, we're one step closer in a way that I don't like.
How about, yeah, go ahead, Buddy.
Yeah. Well, I have a much more pessimistic feeling of our future, particularly considering the direction of how America moving forward. I feel like if the democracy in America keep declining, we might end up in a new period of time that democracy is no longer a global narrative. Rather, the world can be divided by three empires among China, Russia, and America. See what America is doing now. It seems like, you want the Greenland, you want to do a lot of things in the South America, and in the same time, you're just giving away Ukraine to Russia, and it's still pretty unpredictable for America's movement or involvement if China is going to invade Taiwan. So I'm seeing this very terrible future that could happen is Russia will keep, invading European and weakening its power. China will occupy the big East Asia, including Asia Pacific, and America will become an empire itself and occupying your part of the world. Obviously, this will not be an ideal result for the entire human being, and thus, is really depending on the people in America to seeing if this is the future that you want, or if the entire world want this kind of future. I would also say I'm really not a big fan for engagement policy with China at this moment. Yes, dictatorship, authoritarian, cannot sustainable, and it will collapse and having existential crisis to a period of time. But when the economy is intertwined so deeply, there is mentality even in the Western country that a lot of people do not want to see China experiencing a change, because that means devastated consequence for the global economy when all the products and assembly lines are still connecting with China. Thus, even though I'm a big criticizer against Trump, but I do think that it's very important to stop the engagement policy with China in the Democrat camp globally, to basically stopping this intertwine and letting China has its change, which will benefiting for the people inside of China, but also preventing the world being dragged down by the collapsing of the great empire of Xi Jinping.
Well, one more question for you, and then I'll ask you both to pitch the book, which I have done a horrible job talking about, but I was so enchanted discussing the greater context that it came out of that I appreciate it. Last question to you. What is your biggest hope and your biggest fear with China? It could be the regime. It could be what's going on for the Chinese people. I mean, we've been very pessimistic here so far. But I mean, on a hopeful basis, do you think that there's a chance that they'll get another Deng Xiaoping character? alternately that the regime will collapse. I don't know, somehow Taiwan gets moved in the Republic of China because I don't know. What are you rooting for?
The simple thing is, my hope is that there will be a shift in the other direction, which is more liberalization, with a smooth and minimally violent transition to something that's more open. I'm not even hoping for democracy at this point, but uh, that's one. And then two, my biggest fear is that we tend to think of Xi Jinping as less crazy than Vladimir Putin, because Putin likes to throw people out of windows. The Chinese just kill people differently. They let them have cancer and slowly die in prison. It still has the same result in the end. And so my fear is that this semi-fascist autocratic regime with this leader is surrounded with imperfect information like all authoritarians. And frankly, we saw a version of that even in the United States with Biden and his circle, right, protective circle, and how it could influence what information gets in, right? This is just fundamental problem with all leadership roles. But in authoritarian states, it's to the extreme, and that he makes a miscalculation on Taiwan and decides to do something devastating. I just spent 2 months reporting from the island, and it's a beautiful place if you've never been. It's a democracy. It has a functioning universal health care. It has a surplus in terms of the government budget, despite its universal health care. It's got a vibrant democracy, perhaps far too vibrant in terms of the fistfights in the legislature. It has a free press. It has fantastic food. I can go on and on about what a wonderful, wonderful, beautiful place Taiwan is. And the people there just want to be left alone. And my biggest fear is that they will not be left alone, and that there's death and destruction in a very beautiful place, and the only place where Chinese-speaking people have a full and free democracy.
Well, I would strongly echoing with Melissa's point that I feel like for the next 3 to 5 years, it's a critical window for if China is going to invade Taiwan or not. And depending on Taiwan's determination to defend itself, but also very large depending on if the so-called free world would have the willing or the awareness or the understanding that how important it is to giving Taiwan enough support and security and the protection so that deter China's invasion in the next period of time. Then after that, there might be good change that happening in China, given the current trajectory of its economy. However, if what happened in Ukraine is repeating in Taiwan in the next 5 years, then we might see the whole rising of authoritarian globally, and we might see China become a more predominant power in the world, and also see more decline in democracy itself. So that would be my hope, that China will feel its difficulty and do not want to invade Taiwan because it's too much to pay. But it's also depending on if the free world can truly unite itself and support this very democracy of Taiwan with its all strengths.
I am hoping that the entire world will be free and happy, and we'll all get to that 1 point on the 10-point scale and give Iceland a run for its money. That's very much where my heart is. And I've greatly enjoyed talking to you. As I said, I've wanted to talk to you about the context this happened on, and its political program. It made sense. That being said, though, I host a sci-fi podcast. There's a lot of listeners that listen to this show that enjoy that enjoy sci-fi. I love dystopic fiction. So the final thing I'd like for you both to weigh in on is please pitch the audience on your book. Please tell folks, in addition to knowing who you are and where you're coming from, why is your book a good thing for the people that listen to my show to read?
First of all, it's entertaining. I think that's first and foremost. It is not some I mean, especially after you've been listening
We
to
got
us
all the
talk about
vegetables out of the
stuff.
way. All the vegetables are out of the way. This is all entertainment
This
that
is
you're
not an
providing.
educational. We really wanted it to be entertaining and a good story. So that starts. There's about 1,000 panels of Badiucao's beautiful art, and this took 5 years. And it is a near future, dystopian story about a techno-authoritarian China at war with the fascist United States. And if that's all you take from it, fantastic. However, I will say that friends of mine who've bought the book to support me, they've ordered it. It landed on the kitchen table. Their teens take a look at it, grab it, run off with it, and go off and read it. And that really, for me, means so much. This is something that works for teens. This is something that works for adults. If you don't know anything about East Asia, this is a way to start. And also, more than anything, it's an opportunity to reflect on resistance and the costs of resistance. At the end of the day, it's a story about 3 characters. It's very character-driven, and you can choose to learn from it. We put in so many Easter eggs and nuances. It's all there, but you can also just enjoy it.
Wonderful. Badi, give us your pitch.
Well, like I've already said, that I feel like there is a very dark future is looming in front of us. And this very graphic novel might not be the key to solve all the problems, but it does lay out a lot of prediction and understanding from our perspective as Chinese dissent artists, as well as, great journalists. So it may provide you some hope and some way to navigate in this very dark future. But also, to having this book, to buying this book is a great support for pro-democracy dissident like myself.
Great. And I'll add, there's lots of reasons to read the book. There's lots of reasons to enjoy the book. But for people that are occupying, I'm talking to a minority of folks here. There's lots of people that are going to enjoy the book. But I know there's somebody's listening to the program right now who likes graphic novels, found this conversation interesting, and enjoys dystopic science fiction. If you're that person, you should absolutely buy this book because it's going to ring every one of your interests like a bell. And the book that we are talking about is You Must Take Part in Revolution, a graphic novel by Melissa Chan and Badiucao. And thank you both so much for coming on.
Thank you so much, Heaton.
Thank you.
This week's bonus episode is Conspiracies That Actually Happened. Jeffrey Epstein is in the news again as the U.S. Justice Department announced that there's no client list. There's no black book of high-powered perverts to be prosecuted, which has birthed many a conspiracy theory. Some of the conspiracy theories are that other high-powered perverts don't want that list released, and so it's been scuttled, or the original one is that Epstein didn't kill himself. Now, we're not getting into Epstein this week, but the whole episode in the media cycle did get me thinking, what conspiracy theories turned out to be true? We'll be going over a handful of conspiracy theories that actually happened on this week's bonus episode, which will likely drop on Friday or Saturday. You can hear that episode and all of the episodes on The Political Orphanage by going to thepoliticalorphanage.com. The Political Orphanage is made possible entirely by its own listeners. There's no Politburo propping us up, and sadly, there is no Politburo snuffing out our enemies. The Orf is kept entirely afloat voluntarily by people who think that it's worth supporting. If you're one of those people, or you want to hear about conspiracy theories, go to thepoliticalorphanage.com. That's thepoliticalorphanage.com. That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Melissa Chan and Badiucao, for coming on to discuss censorship, exile, and China. And thank you, patrons who make it all possible. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.